Afternoon, everyone. Is that better? Can you hear me at the back? My name is Rachel Besner-Kerr, and I'm the Director of Graduate Studies for the Development Studies Ph.D. program. And I'm a professor in global development here at Cornell University. But most importantly, I am here today as the Special Committee Chair for Emily Baker, and it is in this role that I'm introducing our speaker today, who is giving her exit seminar, which is the final seminar at the end of someone's PhD in our program. So Emily has a wealth of experience that she brought to do her PhD before she started, and that includes, interestingly, a bachelor's degree in literature. So that helps explain the beautiful writing that we were able to enjoy for her dissertation. And she also has 2 master's degrees. She really wanted to make sure she had a breadth of knowledge. So she has a master's degree in international agriculture and rural development, or international agriculture development. No, international. You got the idea. International agricultural development from the University of California in Davis. And she also has a master's degree in community development. And after that, she spent about a decade working in East Africa in a range of different places in Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo and Tanzania. And then she came and began her PhD here at Cornell in development studies. And I had the pleasure of meeting her before she started her PhD when I co-organized a conference called Farm to Plate in Ithaca in 2017. And it was a really neat collaboration with community organizations and some graduate students, myself, and she came to that, and I met her there, and I was really struck by her interest and scientific curiosity and just the breadth of her experience. And I've had the privilege of working with Emily in a number of different ways, not only in advising her in her PhD research and trying to mentor her as she figured out how she was going to do this challenging research that she had set herself out to do, but also she served as the she served with me in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change while I was coordinating the chapter on food systems. She served as the what is it? The scientist? What is the official chapter scientist? Thank you. The chapter scientist, and that was a very challenging undertaking, and so we kind of suffered and struggled and did a lot of work together on that. She helped to coordinate the meetings. She helped make sure all the references were correct. She contributed to the chapter, and that was a very good experience to gain insight into Emily's coordinating skills, her ability to work across cultures and across disciplines, and her commitment to rigorous and stellar research. And so I am really excited to be at this moment of introducing Emily and to say what a privilege it has been to work with her for the last 6 years, and to know her family a little bit, and just to really know Emily as committed both scientist and someone who wants to make a difference in the world. And I don't want to take up any more of your time, but thank you very much, everyone, for coming to hear Emily's exit seminar, and I look forward to listening with you.
Right. I think there's some people that need to be admitted.
Yeah, I'm going to just get on.
Oh,
So she doesn't.
Right. So thanks, Rachel, for the kind introduction, and thanks to everyone here in the room and to those folks for joining online today. This dissertation is entitled Reading the Violent Landscape, Agrobiodiversity, and Making a Life in the DR Congo, Uganda Borderlands. The title and parts of the approach for this research was inspired by Fairhead and Leach's misreading the African landscape, as well as Wessel's reading the forested landscape. I'm so looking forward to sharing this research with you and to our discussion at the end. This dissertation research was carried out in the traditional homelands of the Bukonjo, Babuisi, Batoro, Banande, and Batwa peoples. This research is committed to a deep inquiry into the historical and ongoing uneven power relations, including those which implicate the United States government and economic structures that have shaped the region, culture, and its people's life on the land. In light of what we'll talk about this afternoon, I'd like to invite us to also consider the deep history of the land that we are on. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gaia-Kahono. The Gaia-Kahono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. I acknowledge the painful history of Gaia-Kahono dispossession, and I honor the ongoing connection of the Gaia-Kahono people, past and present, to these lands and waters.
If you can admit me, then I can.
All right, so to start off, let's just locate ourselves in the borderland region of the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo and Western Uganda, where the Rwenzori Mountains, the Mountains of the Moon, which are right here, you can't see them so well, transect the political border between the two countries. This is this white line here is the actual border between Congo and Uganda. The study takes place both in DRC. Here we can see the Congo study sites in the green icons, and in Uganda, which are the bright purple icons. This region is known for many things. It is one of the most biodiverse places in the world. Much of the Rwenzori borderlands is designated as conservation areas, including the Virunga National Park in Congo, the oldest national park on the continent that nearly entirely surrounds the Mutwanga region. This is the Mutwanga region here in Congo. And there's the Virunga National Park. And the Samliki and Rwenzori National Parks in Uganda that make up 2/3 of the land of the Bundibujo district where the Uganda portion of the study took place. This region was also ground zero for Africa's Great War in the mid-1990s, a conflict that was ignited by the Rwandan genocide and took the lives of over 6 million people, displaced vast portions of the region, and set the stage for protracted conflict among governmental forces and a profusion of armed groups ever since. The region is also reputed for its wealth in natural resources, minerals and precious metals, oil, charcoal, fertile soils. From ivory to rubber, mountain gorillas to oil to coltan for fueling the international energy transition, this region has captured interest and interference from actors across the world for hundreds of years. Before starting this Ph.D. program at Cornell, I lived and worked with my partner, now husband, in the Eastern DRC. From the years working in the region, I had several unshakable questions that are the foundation of this dissertation research. The first comes from observing the gradient in the landscape when you move from one side of the political line to the other. The border is really a region, a borderlands, a space that has a character unto itself, rather than a hard line that you build a wall along. The history of the region and its peoples, ecologies, politics, and culture are bound up together. In the borderland region of the Rwenzori mountain range, something really interesting is happening. People are cultivating cocoa agroforestry systems to get chocolate from the cocoa tree. Despite histories of violent conflict, there is so much about violent conflict that makes perennial agriculture difficult. Markets can get disturbed, people can be displaced from their land tenure itself can become more precarious. What is going on for people in the Rwenzori region that makes it possible to be investing in cocoa production? The overarching question for the dissertation research is how and why do people maintain perennial crops, specifically agroforestry, amidst protracted agrarian violence and uncertainty? And the overarching contribution of this work answers that question with the argument that in the longue durée, people's life on the land, their everyday decision-making in pursuit of building a good life, contributes to the unfolding of social, political, and environmental transformations toward perennial cropping systems. reading the landscape and the everyday responses to deep and ongoing histories of agrarian violence and uncertainty allows us to see how the locus of power is shifted from being not only in the hands of the authorities to whom it seems impossible to appeal or sway, but also in the agency of the collective. I took an interdisciplinary approach in this dissertation research, combining applied ecology, ethnography, and participatory methodologies. Overall, this work is guided by a feminist and historical political ecology perspective that links the personal with the political and takes a relational approach to understanding agrobiodiversity, livelihoods, and life on the land. I coordinated 2 research teams, one team in Uganda and one team in Congo, to conduct an interdisciplinary set of research methods. Farmer oral histories recounted the history of their cropping systems, experiences that shaped their decision-making, their observations of transformation in the landscape and community. And we conducted agrobiodiversity assessments of the presence and abundance of different plant species on people's farms. These were coupled with participatory exercises documenting the biocultural use value of different on-farm plants, where people described which plants are important for what biocultural uses and how these plants might benefit the environment, our way of asking about functional diversity. We worked with communities to develop cropping and climate calendars, both historical climate and how the weather patterns have changed, as well as an overview of the gender division of labor on the farm. We conducted key informant interviews with government officials, cocoa extension agents, cocoa cooperatives, and the large cocoa buying companies in the region. I want to touch briefly first on the table setting that an environmental history of the Eastern DR Congo, Western Uganda borderlands can provide for the rest of the study. This photo, taken by ornithologist James Chapin in 1925, is of the Rwenzori Mountain glaciers atop the range that reaches nearly 16,800 feet at its tallest peak. There are only 2 glacial regions on the African continent, and these Rwenzori glaciers are estimated to be gone by 2050. In this portion of the study, I traced this region's political, economic, and socio-environmental transformations from the pre-colonial period through colonization, independence, the tumultuous Great War years, and into the contemporary period. People often characterize this region as being steeped in crisis. Decolonial and indigenous scholarship has been rebutting the notion of crisis for quite some time, this perspective that the world today is freshly inundated with catastrophes that challenge the normal and desired course of action, when there have been hundreds of years of the world remaking of colonial and imperial projects. Crises are not breaks from normality after which we can return to the way things should be. Rather, within the context of people's everyday grappling with uncertainty, precarity, and violent conflict, they're contributing to the social, political, economic, and ecological.
That's Richard.
I ask, what historical environmental transformation happened in the Rwenzori region? And what does that longer socio-political and environmental history help us understand about the focal period for this research, the 1990s to the present? Tracing the longue durée of the region's transformations allows us to see the deep roots of what would otherwise be understood as contemporary crises. So militarized colonial and neo-colonial programs of control over land, labor, and resource extraction reshaped agrarian livelihoods, landscapes, and power relations. Hard border approaches to conservation dispossessed populations from livelihood resources and ancestral territories. Conservation agencies serve as both regional authorities and sites of continued violence. Political and economic power in the peripheral border region shapes state, international, and global transformations. So I want to move now to a specific moment of ecological transformation in the Rwenzori region. And here I'll focus on the Ugandan side of the Rwenzori borderlands. When I first arrived in Bujubujo district in Western Uganda, the district agricultural officer described to me how the landscape of the district, from the river to the mountains, had cocoa planted doorstep to doorstep. Farmer adoption of cacao is nearly wholesale across the lower and midland elevations, and even the highlands microclimates make cacao cultivation possible. I was so curious how this portion of Western Uganda's banana coffee systems became converted to the country's major, and for several decades, only cocoa production region. The answer to this question is rooted in a period of violent conflict, really a period of agrarian terrorism perpetrated by the armed group Allied Democratic Forces, or ADF. ADF is currently affiliated with the Islamic State, but its roots stretch back to colonial policies of indirect rule that shaped power relations and resource access across Western Uganda. This laid the foundation for separatist struggles in the Rwenzori region and ultimately the formation of ADF. In November 1996, on the heels of neighboring Rwanda's genocide, and as the first wave of Africa's World War was raging in what was then Zaire, ADF struck military bases in Bunyubujo district of Western Uganda, and then they turned against civilian populations. ADF tactics then, and as they continue to be today, are largely in the form of terrorism. Political motivations are often oblique, and the violence against civilians is seemingly random and intended to spark fear. People across the district fled their homes and farms to stay with relatives in Congo, to stay in camps for internally displaced persons in the district, or they fled over the mountains to parts of Uganda that were not impacted. For 5 years, people were not able to return home to their farms. The army coordinated foraging expeditions from the camps to harvest from neighboring farms. And when after 5 years, people started returning home, after ADF had been pushed back into Congo, their farms were entirely overgrown by forest and weedy inversion. Their coffee had succumbed to the fusarium fungal disease that had been marching across the continent and finally reached Uganda. People had to cut everything and start over. And when they did, it was the start of wholesale conversion of the district to cacao agroforestry. So why was it that people invested in cacao agroforestry systems in the wake of violent conflict and displacement? Remember that perennial crops, particularly tree cash crops, are not generally what people turn to in these circumstances. So what happened in Uganda? Here I argue for a relational approach to life on the land that I'm calling perennialization. I argue that in the context of the likely reoccurrence of violence, and people certainly do believe that the violence would happen again, given the long history of the region, the transformation of people's cropping systems and ultimately the wider landscape was shaped by their memories of past violence, the particular biology or materiality of the plants they invested in, and the deeper sociocultural legibility of trees. People's investment in perennial agriculture was shaped by their memories of past violence. One farmer in the lowlands near the Congo border remembered this period as a time when one's fundamental connection to life on the land and one's ancestral place of origin was ripped away. To be forced to flee your home, to have family members who perhaps never came home. When people came back to their farms, they realized the fusarium wilt had wiped out the Robusta coffee trees, the dominant cash crop in the region at the time, and the farms were totally overgrown. People had to start their livelihoods over entirely. So for people in Bunyubujo, Uganda, this meant finding a crop that was durable in case they were displaced from their farms again. Now, when people were in the IDP camps, going out to glean from whatever farms were nearby, they noticed that a few people had already planted cocoa. A couple trees here and there, nothing substantial. But when people were looking around, they were seeing that these cocoa trees had matured and were bearing fruit besides not being tended, despite weeds growing up and shade trees closing the canopy overhead. This was convincing enough that some people got their hands on some cocoa seedlings and began sneaking out of the camps at night to plant them. People were going to need something to return to when they got home. And it makes sense. Cocoa is an understory tree from the Amazon tropical rainforest. It likes shade. And it may not yield its maximum with weed pressure or a full canopy overhead, but it will survive. And in the Rwenzori borderland region that sits right on the equator, there are 2 rainy seasons, which means 2 big cocoa harvests a year, plus a steady small production that they could harvest every couple of weeks the rest of the year. If there was another major episode of displacement, and most people estimated that future conflict was likely, people knew that the trees would survive without tending, and that when they returned, there would be, at the very least, a small harvest to get them started up again. The final aspect of this perennialization concept is the sociocultural legibility of trees, which is connected first to a primary cultural tree of the region, Omutoma Ficus natalensis. This tree is planted on graves to signify family lineages. It represents cultural durability, perenniality, beyond one's own lifetime. But the connection runs deeper to an ontological argument about one's being in relationship with the land and the plants on it, as one's first identity, as one farmer described. The origin stories of the peoples of this region include agroforestry systems and gods from the mountains who hold people responsible for environmental stewardship. Similar to the bark tree, planting cocoa was a way of marking one's place on the land, one's tenure on the land. Theobroma cacao is a tree that is most often planted with regular spacing across an entire field, and that planting is both constitutive and demonstrative of one's enduring presence. The trees rooted on one's land not only hold the soils, but also the political understanding of one's tenure in place. Building towards the next chapter in this dissertation, I found that there were gendered differences in perennialization that were rooted in people's different priorities concerning diversification. In particular, women were more concerned about a focus on durable food crops as a hedge against future conflict or displacement. When I asked what they were doing in their cropping systems, if anything, to prepare for another conflict, women specifically indicated that they were planting perennial root crops like cassava or taro that could be left untended if necessary and still yield tubers for their families after even years of abandonment. So in this next chapter, I wanted to explore the differences in diversification strategies and ecosystem multifunctionality, or the capacity of an ecosystem to provide diverse benefits to people and ecosystem function across farming systems in the Rwenzori region. So here I'm looking at both the Congo farms as well as the Uganda farms. I worked with my two research teams in Congo and Uganda to conduct biocultural inventories and agrobiodiversity assessments, along with oral histories of farmers' lives on the land. We worked with 60 farmers in Uganda across 3 agroecosystem gradients, lowland, midland, and highlands, and on 30 farms in Congo and 3 villages that span the midland to highland agroecosystem gradients. From these data, I developed farmer and community typologies that illustrated what kinds of people or communities had different diversification approaches in their agroforestry systems, and some reasoning for why they had these different approaches. And we ended up with a lot of data, so I'll just present some high-level results here. Farmers described their incredibly rich knowledge of plants on their farms, including the local names and their biocultural use values, including foods, medicines, fuel, building, land demarcation, and other cultural use values. Trees stood out as having the most biocultural use values of any plant growth habit. When we asked about the potential benefits of each plant to the environment, or our way of asking farmers about their knowledge of the functional diversity in their plant communities, farmers again described a rich portrait of the different ecological functions these plants serve on their farms. Here again, we see that the trees made up the bulk of what farmers see as the most important ecological functions in their farming systems. I wanted to understand how the plant diversity at a village level differed across the region. The numbers here represent 3 different ways to compare plant diversity. In the first column, we see that the total number of cultivated species observed in Uganda was much higher than Congo, but that was with twice the number of farms surveyed in Uganda. And also note here that we sampled both the cultivated and weedy species on all these farms, but we're focusing here on just the sort of cultivated species. Unfortunately, we were unable to access the 3 other villages in Congo where I'd hoped we could work due to security issues. But I estimated that if we had been able to access those sites, the overall species richness of Congo would have been much higher compared to Uganda. But given the farms we were able to sample across the region, we found that overall, the Congo sites had the same indices of diversity as the Uganda sites as a whole, with half the farms. Because farmers in Uganda had begun planting beans at the time of the study, that skewed the diversity index to make the Congo sites look much less diverse than they actually were. So when we removed the beans, we see that the Congo sites were actually much more diversified compared to the Uganda sites. I argue that this is because in Congo, due to more precarious markets, infrastructures, and security contexts, people need to maintain higher levels of food crop diversity as well as cash crop diversity. Further, the northernmost Congo site has much higher shade tree diversity and much older shade trees overall. So for the Uganda farms, I was able to develop farmer typologies based on a combination of farmer characteristics and plant diversification measures. I then ran a Permanova and NMDS analysis, that's the figure and statistical analysis in the middle here, that showed the similarity of plant communities of each farm. Each of these symbols represents an individual farm. And the closer one symbol is to another, the more similar the plant communities are. So that includes the species presence and abundance of what is conserved on an individual farm. And I really found 4 farm typologies. Those that have gone all in on cocoa, meaning more plantation-style cocoa production, have much less diverse plant communities on their farms compared to more diversified agroecological farmers. I want to highlight 2 different logics shaping these diversification strategies. For young people who have inherited portions of a plantation-style cocoa farm, they see farming as part of a livelihood portfolio that can pay the regular bills. This is school fees, hospital bills, but it's not what you rely on for your food. One young person quipped the national slogan that farming is the backbone of Uganda, but he argued that it's hustling that feeds the belly these days. That perspective stands in contrast with agroecological farmers who regularly cited that all their food comes from the land. These are the farmers who also put voice to the perspective that the land and the plants are one's first identity. I want to highlight another typology of women-managed agroecological farms. These farms are run by women who are either in a polygamous marriage where the husband is effectively absent, except to perhaps come and collect some money during the cocoa harvest season, or whose husbands have passed away due to illness, conflict, or have left the area permanently. The plant communities on the farms managed by these women are the least similar to plantation-style cocoa farms. In other words, agroforestry farms where women have the most agency over decision-making are among the most diverse farms, and they are the least likely to go all in on monoculture cacao production systems. The implications of this are, in part, that women-managed agroecological farms have much higher diversity and biocultural use values of plants on their farms. The ecosystem service multifunctionality, here graphed according to the functional categories that farmers identified, is also much higher compared to all in on cocoa farms. Compare these radar charts for all in on cocoa farms versus these. There are many implications for this, from the overall biodiversity of the agrarian landscapes to livelihoods to food security. But one thing I would like to point out here is the way that maintaining a more diverse agroforestry system can be a strategy for coping with the impacts of violent conflict. When there's a conflict, either in Congo or Uganda, it's common for one's family from the conflict-afflicted side to cross over to the other side to stay with extended family until the conflict abates. This happened during the 1996-2001 ADF conflict in Uganda, as we talked about earlier. And during our field work, the active conflict in Congo had driven people over the border into Uganda. So we were meeting with people who had 5, 10, 20 relatives from Congo currently staying with them. For these women farmers, the strategy for taking care of their family in crisis is to plant more food. These farms are already more diversified, and they double down on that. For farmers who have gone all in on cocoa, the densely planted cocoa trees have closed their canopy, and it's very difficult to plant food crops in between the trees. For these farmers, they are more reliant upon their incomes from the cocoa harvest when their families in crisis come to stay. The income-based strategy and the crop diversification-based strategy have very real implications for coping in times of precarity, for crop diversity and associated agrobiodiversity, for the ecosystem services and the biocultural use values associated with these different systems. So I have one final chapter that I'd like to share with you today. This chapter takes us over to Congo, to the aftermath of the most recent bout of agrarian terrorism perpetuated by the ADF armed group, the same group from our earlier case study in Bujumbura, Uganda. At the same time as this violence, and in its aftermath, farmers reported dramatic flooding that damaged and even destroyed the crops they depend on for the food and their incomes. They attributed this flooding to part of a larger trend toward increasing unreliability of weather patterns and unpredictable extreme weather events, oscillating from droughts to heavy storms. In this chapter, I'm trying to understand how conflict intersects with climate change from a different angle, from the intimate experiences of those living this nexus in their daily lives. Climate justice has often been framed as an international environmental emergency, and yet experiences of climate change are local level phenomena. Exploring the intimate experiences of these phenomena can open up space for how compounding injustices are understood. The question I pose in this chapter is how and why do people maintain perenniality, this concept of a durable life on the land, in the context of compounding agrarian terrorism and increasingly damaging weather extremes? And the answer that I'm working with, and I'm still working with this to be honest, is that perenniality in the context of compounding precarity and uncertainty is rooted in the everyday enactment of building a good life, a life that makes sense, and that is fundamentally relational. In Eastern Congo, there is a common expression in Kiswahili, kutafuta maisha, which literally means seeking a good life, and what could translate as the everyday struggle to create a world that is livable, to create what people see as the good in their lives. So I want to start there. What do people in Mutwanga, Eastern Congo, see as the good in their lives? As one woman farmer described, I am happy because God is helping me get what I want in my life. I am happy because I am farming. There's a house in Mutwanga. There's a house in Mutwanga that has a fresh metal roof, green vines painted onto the sculpted stucco walls, clumps of ebullient orange cosmos cultivated around the yard, and in Sinene season, a giant funnel structure made of tin sheets and a solar-powered spotlight for catching the local delicacy of crunchy grasshoppers. I can imagine the joy the house's owners took in building it and caring for it. Often when farmers described what they found most meaningful in their lives, what makes a good life, they talked about how their livelihoods in agriculture, including their diversified cacao agroforestry systems, afforded them the ability and dignity of building durable homes, providing food for their families, and sending their children to school. Self-provisioning from one's own farming is fulfilling, as one man described. What I am most proud of in my life is that the food I eat is not bought, it is from my garden. This includes firewood and all other things. Going to the market is just to buy some meat for sauce, but all things are gotten from the garden. A livelihood based in agriculture is something to be proud of, not purely for the economic merits, but also for the way of being in relationship with the plants and the land that it affords. One farmer described how he will sometimes go to the field, even for no reason, just to look at the beauty of the plants. Another woman smiled as she described how sometimes you just feel so good in the garden. You really feel happy. You may find it has already reached 6 p.m. when you don't want to leave the garden. From 2019 into 2021, ADF launched a new round of attacks against civilians in the Mutwanga region of Eastern DRC. Looting, abductions, assault, and killings were all experienced by civilians. The terrorist-style tactics of the armed group impacted people and farms through relational transformations of violence. The violence was not just an incursion of an armed group, but a remaking of everyday social relations within the community and with authorities and with people's cropping systems. Increased violence led to a rupture of people from their fields, a process that uprooted the very socio-natural connection that facilitated many people's sense of a good life. It was not safe to go to the fields to work or even collect food. As one woman described, where the rebels were being witnessed, people kept on farming, but it was risky, and even getting bananas was difficult, so you just cut a bunch and run. People's experience of this conflict contrasted with their memories of former wars. As one man described, that war was good, because people could hide in the bush or on their farms. That war was better, because it was between the rebels and soldiers, not civilians. Whenever you hear gunfire, then you hid in the bush, waited from there, and when the gunfire was silent, then you went back to your homes. But the current war is against the population and their gardens. The relative safety of the region was shattered, and many people fled the community for the larger cities of Beni and Butembo to the west. Others stayed in Mutwanga, camping out in their fields to protect their crops from theft, though it was incredibly risky if they were to be encountered by ADF. Crop theft was rampant among crops that were easy to transport, eat, or market. The perpetrators included the ADF armed group, Congolese soldiers, and local youth who were either profiteering off the disorder or desperate to feed their families. Cocoa is generally more resilient to crop theft, as it is hard labor to harvest, transport, and process for sale. However, cocoa was still being stolen during this conflict. The relational violence brought on by ADF was coupled with a period of extreme rainfall. As one farmer described, that rain started last year and is still going on even up to this year. It is this rainfall that caused our bananas to fall down. It had been predicted and announced over the radio how it would rain too much, so we were preparing for it. But when it rained, it was indeed to the level of destroying our crops. I had shade trees in my garden that fell onto my crops and damaged them. People were coming out of the conflict, what many described as a war, with hopes of rebuilding their lives through rebuilding their farming systems, reconnecting with their land. Many people found their fields were damaged by theft or neglect, and that was compounded by the extreme rain saturating the region. As one woman described, I have never experienced such kind of rain since my birth. I have been sharing this with my friends, and it is the same story from those friends. Really, if it will continue this way, there will be no more crops in the garden. Often in climate change discourses, we center knowledges involved in planned adaptation, the NGO adaptation project, the governmental resilience scheme, and the ways those institutions and actors interact with different forms of local knowledge. But in this area of Eastern Congo, these formal adaptation projects and even NGO actors are not present. What constitutes authority in Eastern Congo when it comes to appealing for help with weather extremes? There are no institutionalized conversations and trainings. There is no formal financial assistance or insurance. During an interview, one woman quipped, "You have the big phone, you call someone." People turn to their neighbors. They reach out to the extension agent from their local cooperative. They listen to the local radio programs about agroforestry and weather predictions. Many people attributed the change in rainfall patterns to deforestation in the Virunga National Park that surrounds the Muchwanga region, and to the felling of trees on people's farms and in public spaces. You know, we are close to the park, and that park brings our rain. Destabilizing the trees of the region means destabilizing their rains. When it comes to the conflict, there were high-level actions taking place, including President Tshisekedi's appealing to Uganda to send their military to go after ADF, a fraught proposition that was deeply unpopular among Eastern Congolese civilians, as they feared a recurrence of international exploitation in the region. The Congolese army is deeply corrupt across the ranks. As one man in Muchwanga described, you realize within the government there are elements which fuel these conflicts, in fact. Since public authorities largely failed to protect communities from harm, some farmers tried to take on authority themselves to safeguard their livelihoods. They would place booby traps or bad omens in their fields. Others would camp out, lying and waiting to confront the thieves. Taking matters into one's own hands was risky, however. As one male farmer described, reducing thieves is very hard. The government soldiers unite with our male youth to steal our produce while guarded by their guns. What can you say or do when the gun is there? Female farmers have even less recourse, as none of them would dare to physically guard their field against theft. Lying and waiting for the thief, only to find that it was a neighbor's child or one's own nephew stealing crops, that did not bring many people peace either. As one woman described, those who steal our crops are the ones who no longer reach their gardens due to the war. So if the war can end, then everything will be fine. So I turn back to the central question of how and why do people maintain perenniality amidst compounding agrarian terrorism and increasingly damaging weather extremes? And I came to the answer that perenniality, in the context of compounding precarity and uncertainty, is rooted in the everyday enactment of building a good life, a life that makes sense and that is fundamentally relational. Kutafuta maisha mzuri. The good life here is defined by farmers themselves. I am happy because God is giving me what I want in my life. I am happy because I am farming. This woman's statement takes on a different meaning in the wake of thinking about everything she and her community had gone through. Building a good life, a durable life on the land, this is not without struggle. This chapter highlights some of the challenges, contradictions, and profound injustices at this conflict climate nexus. But I argue here that we can orient our understanding of these injustices from the perspective of those who are experiencing them in their everyday lives. So with a brief conclusion, I would like to circle back to the central contribution of this dissertation. In the longue durée, people's life on the land, their everyday decision-making in pursuit of building a good life contributes to the unfolding of social, political, and environmental transformation towards perennialization. Reading the landscape and the everyday responses to deep and ongoing histories of crisis allows us to see how the locus of power is shifted from being not only in the hands of the authorities to whom it seems impossible to appeal this way, but also in the agency of the collective. For the sake of time, I'll save this to go over in case you have questions. But I'd like to end with gratitude. If I can make it through it. for all the farmers, government officers, extension workers, cocoa company agents, liaisons who participate in this research, to my Congolese colleagues, Roberto Mula, Mutsembe Lusenge, Hindo Aji, and Joseph Kikoma, my Ugandan colleagues, Goli Olis, Stephen Tembo, Harriet Musumba, and our dear host, Wilson Mahamuda and Clemens Fair. This work would not have happened without them. Maybe gratitude to my committee, vigilance and courage, and both student study power. Love and thanks to my family, friends, and colleagues who have the beach and support this book before we approve. My guys, ground family. And thank you to the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. This is being the Biodiversity Fund and the Cornell Graduate School for funding this research. Very much. My kid gave me a head cold about a week and a half ago. I've been trying to get through here. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It's just congratulations. And my question is, to me, this is like a really great example of like interdisciplinary mixed methods research. And I was wondering what came out of more of the qualitative side that was maybe surprising to you or really added depth to the quantitative elements of your analysis, and how you kind of benefited from merging the two.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think it's something that, thinking about sort of political ecology, it's something that people have been grappling with for a long time. And I would say that this is perhaps maybe not even as like much of an integrated approach as I would have wanted. But I think there's a lot of ways that they do sort of weave together in this project. So I'd say for the components, particularly in the part of it where we're thinking about the multifunctionality of these systems, and in developing those farmer typologies, there was maybe perhaps the most intimate weaving of the qualitative and quantitative works, looking at a number of different biodiversity measures for all of these farms, and comparing that against the stories that people were telling about their farms, the sort of like long-term histories that they had. So that was a way of sort of bringing together those typologies. I would say that's probably maybe the best example.
I was, first of all, wonderful. Thank you so much. I was looking forward to your presentation. Thank you so much. I was wondering if you could comment a little more on how was it, because you mentioned that you coordinated like 2 groups. If you could tell us more about that experience, how did you find like the persons that you were going to collaborate with? How was that whole thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I just want to acknowledge, actually, we do have some folks from Congo and Uganda that are joining us remotely, so it's wonderful that they're here as well. So I would say on the Ugandan side, I was able to connect with my colleagues through a professor at Congo University, Professor Kubika, and he had a student, and we sort of snowballed with students who had gone to the local university that's closer to the Rwenzoris, and so I was able to connect with Kule and Tembo that way. I would say connecting with the cocoa cooperatives there, that's actually coming out of a long-term friendship with the cocoa cooperative. That originally my husband connected with the organizer of that cooperative years and years and years ago. And then we were able to work with a cooperative that actually works both in Congo and in Uganda. So I had worked with the Congolese folks, the Congolese cocoa farmers, when I lived in Congo, and then was able to connect with them when I extended the research to Uganda. In terms of the Congo research, that was collaboration that came out of years of working together with my colleagues there. So we'd worked together when I was doing research out of Virunga National Park, and then sort of were able to carry that relationship forward. I would say it's like of note, given the context of the conflict in Congo, we did really try to work with farmers that we knew. And so we weren't necessarily doing any, this was really like going to people who knocked on their door, like we'd known them for years at that point. And so it was, there was already that relationship to be able to have some of these conversations. We weren't interested in necessarily having anyone feel uncomfortable with their presence. Yeah.
Maybe Emily stand closer to the mic, if otherwise the online folks won't be able to hear.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah, just congratulations, such a beautiful presentation. It really touched me. I had a question kind of about, I love this idea and this notion that seems so strong in this area of like trees and planting of trees as sort of part of sustaining your life on the land, but also your identity and sort of in other parts, especially like in rural Kenya, I've seen that really tied to the idea of a title deed and like formal land tenure, which I presume is maybe not possible or sort of a historical marker in this area, but I'm curious how often the idea of land tenure came up and how that played out in your conversations.
Yeah, so that is kind of a very big can of worms in this context.
Yeah.
We're looking at multiple systems in both of these countries over time.
Mhm.
And so in both of these cases, I know that at least in some cases you'll have like maybe separate deeds for the resources on the land versus the land itself, this sort of thing. And that's not necessarily the case in this region. But it does come up in a number of different ways. So thinking about the ways that, so in both of these regions, there's layers of the sort of governmental tenure system layered with customary tenure systems, layered with, I would say, a deeper, longer history of understanding the life on the land at that sort of cultural tenure. And I think there's something that happens differently with the tenure system in the Mutwanga region versus maybe other places in North Kivu, and some of that depends on sort of local governance structures around the tenure system. One piece that I think is interesting on the Uganda side that I want to dig into a little bit further, but particularly in thinking about that perennialization concept, is that looking sort of further back and under the Idi Amin administration, basically dissolved all the customary systems of tenure. So there was a long period where that customary system wasn't sort of formally observed, and it was very dangerous to sort of observe that formal system, the customary system. But I think that there are legacies that really like held through, like that didn't destroy the customary system. And so I'm curious to sort of dig into that piece a little bit further about like how the sort of like long history of reforms of the land tenure system might relate or not to the way that people think about tenure on land.
That's super interesting.
Hi, thank you so much, and congratulations again. I'm curious about, it kind of related to the land tenure, but I'm curious about the people when they facing violence or climate disasters that is strong enough to bring like displacement to those people. So where do they go if they have to move, and how they can keep connection to their own land, or where they can find a land to get started again?
Sure. Yeah, so I think as I mentioned in the presentation, when there is, as this is sort of this borderland region, people have relatives, on the other side of the international border, right? The border was set up by a colonial administration that ended up sort of having an arbitrary line that split families, and so if there's a conflict in one place, you can go across the border to stay with family. If you're in Uganda, you can go to Congo. If you're Congo, you can go to Uganda. If you were during the conflict in the Mutwanga region, if people had to leave, they would leave going further west. There's two large cities that are further west. If people were in the Congo, they need to go that way. In Uganda, people could go over the mountains to another part of Uganda. And I think one piece of that I did find so compelling was this idea that that you can leave and come back and have your land waiting for you, which is not necessarily the case in some of the parts of North Kivu province in Congo where we lived, where you really couldn't do that. You know, if you in a place like deeply further west of the arid region called Lubero, like it, you know, people are selling the land 5-6 times over. If you leave your land, like you're not going back to it. So there was something about this Rwenzori region that was really striking to me when we first started looking at it, that people were able to go back to their land after they left. And I think this is really sort of where this idea of perenniality sort of comes in, is like what made it possible. Not just be investing in these perennial agricultural systems, but the way that that sort of related to people's tenure on the land. Like how did that also contribute to the way that people rooted on the land, to be able to have the security of going back to the land, even if they were displaced. Or like across the board in Uganda, when I asked people about that, it's like, were you ever worried that you, and they're like, absolutely not. Like this is the land. You know, there's no, they were not worried about being able to return to the land.
Like, I feel, I don't know, I feel so humbled, I feel so inspired. I feel like you struck an amazing equation between how you care and you are committed to the place that you are doing your research and with the people you are doing your research in, and also how you move forward, like your practicality of getting things done is so inspiring on many levels. So I'm very inspired by that. And also one thing that's actually in the theory that you are using and how you use with it, I have been like having this stuckness between like the political economy of understanding things with the affective part and this pockets of African memory, and like, you know, and how to entangle that in a very material, like tangible way, and you are doing it perfectly. So thank you so much. I don't know if
Did you hear that, Rachel?
So yeah, it's really inspiring, to be honest. And I have a question that's not related necessarily to what you presented. But what are you doing with the gift of how are you carrying yourself with it, right? We talked about it, like places that you have these connections with, these commitment to, and then over like few days conflict, everyone is like threatened. This is everywhere. Like how are you living with that? Like how are you carrying this forward in the practical ways that you do, and also in the effective way?
First of all, thank you, Yomna. It means a lot coming from you. I know that you're, yeah, to hear that. And thank you for your question. It's a hard question. Yeah. I think that one of the things for me is just that these are long-term relationships. These are long-haul relationships. And you know, they're sort of like our lives and move through it, but sort of holding that as a core value and a commitment. And these are our friends. I think that is a guiding value in all of this. And you're right, it is the worst nightmare to be able to, like, in the moment of upheaval, to be able to leave. I honestly don't know if I have a great answer for it. It's something where it's I think you made, like, you do everything you can. You wake up, you are paying attention, trying to continue the conversation, trying to have, you know, it's, yeah, it can be very surreal to move between worlds. Yeah, I don't know if I have much better answer for that right now, but yeah. I don't know, actually, is there any way to see
I
questions?
haven't seen
online?
any questions
Okay.
on point.
There is not gonna give me anything.
Well, if we don't have any more questions for Emily, let's give her a.
Thanks to everybody that joined online. I really appreciate it. If you have anything else you want to chat through, I'd be really happy to get it.
Please enjoy the snacks, folks.